Hello, my name's Osha. I like talking about American presidents. I'm continuing my discussion on the Declaration of Independence. I did an earlier video in which I discussed a short review of the Declaration written by Jeremy Bentham, which was sort of a rebuttal to the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to do another video and discuss John Lynn's rebuttal as well, which was really full of ad hominems and whatnot. Now, as I've said, I want to maintain balance in, my analysis of, the U.S. presidents. And while my last video in which I discussed what Bentham said, and I'm going to discuss another, in the future, what John Lynn's rebuttal was. They were full of ad hominems and they basically excoriated, the Declaration of Independence and our founding fathers as well. In fact, John Lynn called them delusional, right? So I don't know if that's the first time that our representatives were called crazy. So John Lind calls them delusional, and he also refers to their low status, right? He called them simple individuals, so it was full of ad hominems, it was invective, polemical, and but I want to also provide balance and say why the Declaration of Independence is viewed as a masterpiece and a remarkable historical document. Indeed, it is. Apart from the eloquence, I've talked about the eloquence of Thomas Jefferson. The document is clear, it's concise. It's only 2 pages, right? And it says a lot. It's packed with a lot of things. As I said, and it's simple, right? Ordinary people can understand it, even though it was written by lawyers, right? So today, what I want to do is show how it was a remarkable historical figure, right? Later on, I'm going to discuss how because it's a piece of literature, and you have to understand literary works, things from humanity. They are subjective. They're subject to bias. They're not like science, right? Things that are scientific and you can be easily objective, and they're bright lines, that you can easily use to assess a document. On the one hand, you know, the authors, our framers think that's an excellent document because they were lawyers themselves. But you see lawyers on the other side. Jeremy Bentham was a barrister, was a lawyer. So was John Lind. But these people are saying, well, this is an illogical document. These people who wrote this are delusional. Things like that. So that's one of the challenges, of assessing things in law. Law are very subjective, and things in literature, the humanities, they're very subjective, right? They're subject to bias. Do people like you or do they not like you? So they're not impartial. But I want to point out that our framers were actually indeed honest brokers. They did have real grievances, and you can actually use that Declaration of Independence as a template for what came later on. It became a template for the Bill of Rights and our U.S. Constitution. And I'm going to go over how things from the Declaration of Independence actually got translated into our Bill of Rights precisely. So it addressed those grievances that we had, and it also serves as it it presaged historical events that would happen later on. For instance, what I mean is, take for instance a text. Let me try and quote it. A text from the Declaration of Independence. Um, it says, it accuses the king for taking, that he constrained. This is how it goes, right? I'm trying to recall from memory. This is how it goes. That he constrained our fellow citizens, taken captive on the high seas, to bear arms against their country, right? And to become the executioners of their friends and their brethren, right? Or to fall hands, uh, you know sorry, or to fall themselves by their hand. Let me try and repeat that. I've said it because it was so. Again, the document is so florid. You like the language, in the way it's the style of Thomas Jefferson, the way it's written, but at the same time, it's actually saying something significant. It's not frivolous. It's saying things significant, and that's what I'm trying to draw out here. So it goes that he constrained, our fellow citizens, right? He constrained our fellow citizens, right? Taken captive on the high seas, right? He constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas, right? To bear arms against their country and to be the executioners, right? To be the executioners of their friends and brethren, right? Or to fall themselves by their hands, right? So that is what I mean by it besieged historical events. So what I just described, right? What I just read, from memory, what I just recalled from memory from the Declaration is actually the definition of impressment, right? Impressment. So that was a term that was used later on in the War of 1812. It was actually the cause of the War of 1812. So impressment was where the British, right, the British Royal Navy was literally seizing Americans from merchant ships, and they could go and raid American ports and just seize American citizens and impress them, force them into the British Royal Navy to become soldiers to fight against uh, the Americans or the French, because the Brits were actually in war against the French. So what was funny was that the British at that time, this was what caused the War of 1812. The British at that time still were viewing, insultingly, were still viewing Americans as British subjects, right? Even though the war was over and America was now independent since 1783. They'd had their treaty, right, the Treaty of Paris, but the British were still viewing Americans as British subjects. So they were, as I just read from the Declaration, that's actually the definition of impressment. It goes that, uh, what the king did, that he constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against uh, against their country, right? To bear arms against their country, and to be the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hand. So basically, that's what impressment was. And so there was a War of 1812, and historically, it's also called the Second War of Independence. Because America had to go to war against England again over this matter, and so you see that document, it's it's a presentiment of what would happen, a historical event. So it was a real grievance, right? Something historical would happen later on, and you see other issues, right, that it raises. It invokes. Yes, the document is also full of uh, logical fallacies, like ad hominems when it's calling the king a tyrant. He's ill-suited. He's not fit to lead a free people, and it also makes these false appeals to emotion. It invokes appeals to emotion instead of just stating the facts. Like when Thomas Jefferson is saying that he'd actually engaged, that the king had engaged foreign mercenaries who were on their way to kill them, right? I don't know how truthful that was. And he says things like that he was inciting he used the pejorative, the derogatory term, the merciless Indian savages. Was referring to the Native Americans, and I would rather not use that language. So things like that, the use of ad hominems, the use of racist terms, they can tend to diminish the remarkable quality of the document. So he does that, and you can see even when he's referring to the to Native Americans, you can see how later on It's sort of like a presentiment of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, where Americans continue to be in conflict with with Native Americans, and it led subsequently to the Trail of Tears, with the Indian Removal Act of 1830 under uh, President Andrew Jackson, right, in 1830. So much later on. So you can see identify all the milestones, significant milestones of American history, things that define us in that Declaration of Independence. And importantly, I'm going to show how it was a template for the Bill of Rights and the U.S. Constitution. So you see the Trail of Tears is there. It shows the War of 1812. It has markers significant in the War of 1812. And let me quickly dive in though. Let me dive in now at this point and go into the aspects, elements that got translated in the Bill of Rights. And as they say, the first will be last and the last will be first. So the last grievance, right? There were 28 grievances, but the last discrete grievance, right, was towards the end where he's talking about the petition, right? How they had petitioned the king and he refused to answer. Instead, he threw injuries upon them. The king ignored their petition for a redress of their grievances, right? Um, Later on, what he's saying after that is basically generalized and repetitive, what he'd actually talked about earlier on. But the last significant discrete grievance is regarding the petition of a redress of the petition of their grievances. And we know that very well as the First Amendment. So the last grievance became our First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. I've done videos discussing what the Bill of Rights are. The Bill of Rights were authored by a protege of Thomas Jefferson. That's James Madison. He's often called the father of the U.S. Constitution. So the Bill of Rights were constraints on the federal government, on the government, right? Because the federal government was sort of taking the place of the crown now. And so the states were concerned and wanted to have constraints, limits on the federal government. So you can see the grievances, the complaints that they had in the Declaration against the crown. They made their way into the Bill of Rights and the U.S. Constitution. So you see the First Amendment, that's the regarding petition of grievances, right? So that's actually in the Declaration. And that was the last discrete grievance that the framers had cited in the Declaration of Independence. Now, in our Second Amendment, right, it talks about right to bear arms. So uh, you can see how that addresses the issue of insurrections, right? Because they complain about the king, exciting insurrections and also setting Native Americans on them. So you can see the concern of the framers to have for there to be militias and the citizens to be able to defend themselves, right? So you see that in the right to bear arms. That's the Second Amendment. And also that goes into our U.S. Constitution, right? The U.S. Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, that deals with the power of Congress to declare war and to raise armies, to declare war, raise armies, and fund the army. So you see the concerns, the grievance concerning the insurrections and the invasions, and in fact, the Declaration ends with America declaring their independence and their rights to declare war. And so you see that goes into U.S. Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, and also Article 1, Section 9, which talks about rebellions and invasions, and public safety, and that's when habeas corpus, the guarantee of habeas corpus can be suspended. So you see these concerns in the Declaration, they're going into the U.S. Constitution, they're going into the Bill of Rights. And that's the Second Amendment, right? You see where towards the end where he talked about the king sending foreign mercenaries to come and kill them. So you see that concern is addressed in the Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment, where Americans have the right to bear arms, right, to defend themselves. So you also see in the Third Amendment, right, the Third Amendment says it prevents the quartering of soldiers. Quartering of soldiers is where quartering of soldiers is when, back then British soldiers, they could just go and seek accommodation and shelter and food, room and board in citizens' homes, and they couldn't resist. Right, that violates their privacy rights. It violates their rights. So you see that went into our Third Amendment. So, and that grievance is actually in the Declaration. It's interesting. So he starts off talking about he actually expressly says it, that the king had sent, soldiers. There was a quartering of soldiers, so that's what it's called, quartering of soldiers, right? It mentioned it expressly. And Thomas Jefferson also states that the king had created offices, numerous offices, and sent swarms of officers, to come and eat out their substance, right? So that remind me, you see the classical references and the classical training of Thomas Jefferson, our founding fathers. And I'm going to do something again later on, just discussing the education of our founding fathers. But you see the classical training that invokes, it brings to mind Homer in the Odyssey, right? So Odysseus, right, had actually, he was the king of, was it uh, what was that? What was it called? Was it Ilia, or Ithaca or something? Yeah. Anyway, but so Odysseus was held captive for, was it about 19 years, almost 2 decades or so, and his son Telemachus, of course, what he had was his, the wealth, assets of Odysseus, his estate was his inheritance. So because Odysseus' wife was there were various suitors who were coming, and Telemachus would say that, well, they had eating him out, that they were eating him out of um, of um, of home and house, right? They were eating him, they eat him out of home and house. And although that was a British reference because it was translated from Greek, but it was in Homer. And so Thomas Jefferson uses it when of the soldiers, the officers, when you said that the king had sent swarms of officers, right, to eat them out of substance, right? And so it sort of evokes Homer, the Greek classics, Odysseus, right? When Telemachus, his son, is saying that his mother's suitors were eating him out of home and house. Um, so you see that makes it into the Third Amendment, the prohibiting the quartering of soldiers. So you can see all of these things, they all come in. Then they complained of juries, right? They said the king had also prevented them of, trial by jury. So you see that becomes a guarantee in the Sixth Amendment. The Sixth Amendment says that it guarantees a fair trial, knowing your charges, trial by jury. He had complained about the king just transporting them. They wouldn't know their charges, just transporting them overseas to be tried, right? So, for pretended offenses, right? They wouldn't know what the offenses were. So you see the Sixth Amendment is saying you have a right to know your charges. You have a right to a public trial by jury, to have counsel, a speedy trial, fair trial. So you see those guarantees inside the Sixth Amendment, because it was actually a grievance that was raised that the king would just transport them overseas for pretended offenses, so they wouldn't know why. That was an accusation they were making, a grievance that they didn't know why the king could just take them, have them arrested and transport them overseas. They wouldn't know what their charges were, and they were denied a trial by jury. And so you see that in our Sixth Amendment, guaranteeing you to know, a defendant to know what their charges are, to have a fair and speedy trial, and to have a public trial by a jury. Okay, so you also see that deals with due process as well. Due process is in the Fifth Amendment, right? Due process is the Fifth Amendment, and so you see it protects your rights, the rights of the accused, and that's the Fifth Amendment. Um, Now, importantly, they also referred to the king and you know the king preventing them from establishing judicial administration and independent judiciary. They said the kings that justices, judges were served at the will of the king. They didn't. Their tenure was at the will of the king. Their salaries were at the will of the king, and so you see that complaint, is addressed in our U.S. Constitution in Article 3. Article 3 creates an independent judiciary, right? And with Congress's ability to create inferior courts, it creates the Supreme Court, and it establishes basically life tenure for judges, for federal judges, because it's saying, during good behavior, right? So they can only be, it's understood that it's life tenure. When a judge is appointed, they can only be removed by impeachment for wrongdoing, right? So they have life tenure during good behavior. So it uh, it's supposed to safeguard their independence, so they don't serve at the will and under duress of Congress or the president, as they did under the king. And you can see regarding their salaries are, they're not subject to being reduced or altered, reduced by Congress. So they have salaries, their protection of their salaries in the U.S. Constitution in Article 3, life tenure of the judges, and their independence. They're not influenced, they're not coerced by Congress or by Congress or the president once it's because they have life tenure, during good behavior. So you see that's addressed, right? And that was a grievance they had in the Declaration. So it's a remarkable text. It's brilliant. It's a very remarkable, magnificent text. And you've got to understand U.S. history, the Constitution, to be able to appreciate it. And so you see how these things translated, directly. They did mention taxes. I'd mentioned how Jeremy Bentham, in his short review, does what's called a straw man fallacy, right? He misrepresents what the argument is, what the main point is, the debate, and to create a weaker point, and so they can attack it, right? Jeremy Bentham says, hey, look, that the problem was taxes, right? But that wasn't what it was. In fact, taxes came down. It didn't go into detail. There are 28 grievances. But Jeremy Bentham, in his short review, right, he misrepresents um, the grievances as just being a matter. The primary thing was taxes, and that was the primary source of contention, bone of contention, which was not the case, right? So he could easily defeat it, and that's what you call a straw man fallacy, right? You misrepresent the argument, so you can easily, for weaker, complaints, that you can easily defeat. And the issue of taxes, he could easily defeat, right? And that's why I think historians and Americans generally, we have sort of taken the bait and we've made it seem like the grievance was taxes. The issue of taxes, right, was Stamp Act. It had been resolved a decade before, right? So the Stamp Act was in 1765, right? March 1765. It went into effect, I think, was in November 1765. But because the people protested, there were boycotts. They protested. There was a lot of rebellion regarding the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was a stamp on printed materials, newspapers, and things like that. The king was imposing taxes on printed materials, printed documents, in the colonies. So, but the Stamp Act, because of the people's resistance, right, even though it went into effect in 1765, it was repealed in 1766. So that had been resolved, and that's why Jeremy Bentham disingenuously brings that up. That well, the issue is taxes. That because taxes have been resolved, right? So he doesn't address all these numerous serious grievances. Although Jeremy Lind, you know, provides a counter argument to the 28 grievances, right? So, but the issue of taxes was raised, but tangentially, right? But you can see that comes up later on in the 13th Amendment. So the US, because the US government, Congress now establishes federal income tax as law in the 30, in the 16th Amendment in 1913. The 16th Amendment under President Woodrow Wilson, federal income tax became established and it became law. Um, so what the people were saying that well, those taxes were imposed without the consent of the people, and so there were many other grievances that came up, about the people not being having the right to that their legislatures were dissolved, right? Their legislatures had been dissolved and things like that. Um, so there were numerous things that were raised as grievances, and we see these things went into the Bill of Rights, and so you can see, um, uh, for instance, in the Ninth and Tenth Amendment, where it's talking about powers, the delineation of powers, powers that are retained by the people and the states, powers that that are constitutional. If it's not in the Constitution, then the federal government is understood not to have those powers, right? So you can see that was important because they were saying the government that that the king was acting arbitrarily by dissolving their legislatures, for instance, by just arbitrary action. So you can see how that was very important, and it came in the Ninth and the 10th Amendments in the Bill of Rights. You know, so importantly, right, the historians who've said, well, the main source of contention was lands, that the founding framers wanted the lands west of the Mississippi. They wanted to be able to control lands and, which the king had imposed constraints on, right? They need authorization and, the king had established conditions for their, on constraining the ability to acquire lands. And they did mention this, close to the beginning of the grievances. They said that the king had raised conditions regarding the appropriation of lands. This is soon after they talk about immigration, that the king, was preventing laws for the naturalization of foreigners and migrations hither. Migrations hither means, to emigrate. So they needed immigrants, right? They needed immigrants. So you can see how immigration has always been critical to America. In fact, towards the end, the framer, Thomas Jefferson, discusses how that they had emigrated and resettled and settled in the Americas, and it sort of had changed their relationship to Parliament, to their countrymen, to their British brethren, right? And in that instance, you can see where he also uses another logical fallacy where he's trying to appeal, a false appeal to emotions, because he's also trying to be ingratiating when he's saying that, well, there's consanguinity between them. Consanguinity, that means, their blood ties, between, between people, individuals or parties. And so he's appealing to that. But he's also emphasizing that, well, they've emigrated and they've resettled, and he's complaining about the jurisdiction that Parliament, that their foreign governments, foreign legislatures still trying to impose jurisdiction over them when they should be ruling themselves. So this is very important because they were saying the king was dissolving their parliaments, their legislatures, and trying to subject them to foreign jurisdictions, so foreign legislatures, and he's also referring to their relationship with uh, the king's relationship vis-a-vis the Native Americans as well. So You see, all of these things, they have their place in U.S. history. They come about, they're revisited either in the U.S. Constitution or in the Bill of Rights, or something that, or a historical event, right, or statutes. The Indian Removal Act, uh, the uh, taxation comes up in the 16th Amendment in 1913. So all of these things are very significant. And, you know, uh, it's a remarkable text. Thomas Jefferson, the framers, the Committee of Five, did a remarkable job, and in being able to uh, properly distill what the issues were, right? They did a great job in distilling what the issues were, because all of these things were addressed in the Bill of Rights, the US Constitution, and they come up in US history over and over again. During the period of manifest destiny, you see the desire of early Americans to acquire new lands. And you see that grievances in there regarding conditions the king had placed upon them regarding appropriation of lands. Immigration is significant. They wanted immigration. What is ironic is later on, the founding fathers who were uh, they were rebelling against the king, uh, getting independence, saying the king was preventing immigration and naturalization. Later on in the 20th century, we and starting with the 19th century, our government the executive started to pass a series of infamous anti-immigration laws. There was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 under President Chester A. Arthur. There was also the Immigration Act of 1917 under Woodrow Wilson, which was barring Asians. There was the Immigration Act under President Coolidge in 1924, barring Asians, placing a quota on nationalities who could come into America. And so you could see a pushback, the back and forth. But all of these things, they find uh, their provenance in the Declaration of Independence. So it wasn't a frivolous, useless document. It's a very significant, remarkable document. It embodies, it encapsulates United States history, what became our Constitution and our Bill of Rights, and it has our zeitgeist in it, right? Um, I want to make sure that I cover all the bases. I'm going to do a subsequent video in which I'm going to be discussing John Lynn's rebuttal. It's called An Answer, and it was full of ad hominems, and it basically disparages the founding fathers. Again, like I said, he called them delusional, but they did write an excellent, they came up with an excellent document. It's a masterpiece in literature. So even though it's florid, it's flowery, it also is very weighty. It's incisive. It is, it does really address the serious and genuine grievances of the founding fathers. They weren't delusional, as John Lind, uh, uh, you know, disparagingly called the framers. Um, so I want to make sure that I covered everything. The main. I've talked about the quartering, that was very significant. Um, and I talked about the importance, the significance of the petition, right? The petition for redress of grievances and the appropriation of lands, immigration. These were very important um, grievances that were in the Declaration. And so uh, I think I've covered the main points. If I recall anything, I'll do a short video. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and I also draw attention to color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts. My constitutional rights have been violated by a corrupt, racist, and xenophobic judge in Montgomery County, Maryland, Judge James Bonifant, who's perverted the course of justice. Right? It's a violation of, it's contradistinct, it's contrary to our values. And you see our values that were reflected in the Declaration of Independence, and in the Bill of Rights. My Fourth Amendment rights were violated. My Sixth Amendment's rights to a fair and speedy trial have been violated. I've not had a fair trial. Judge Bonifan has provided false evidence. He's fabricated evidence, and he's encouraged the fabrication of evidence by crooked Montgomery County Police, who violated my Fourth Amendment rights, violated my rights on May 16, 2023, when they swatted and raided me based on false accusations in order to obstruct justice in a federal EEOC complaint that I had filed, and to obstruct justice regarding Office of Special Counsel complaint that I filed regarding fraud in the Department of Defense and Department of the Navy. Again, my name is Olurotimi Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.